So I've been playing Last Epoch recently after grinding away at Diablo 4 for a while, and I can honestly say that even despite the so-called honeymoon phase right now, it's really felt like Last Epoch has done a lot of things right in terms of the fundamentals of a good ARPG. And so far I've been progressing pretty well through the game, I would say, on my level 37 Shaman, focusing on the Tempest Strike ability, which is kind of a build I try to come up with myself. But anyhow, I've not only been impressed with how sort of easy it is to get acquainted with all the mechanics and progressing through the game in general, even for like someone not really following any build guides, right? But also, I've started to appreciate a lot of the more complex and intricate and sort of decision-making elements, as in the more RPG-esque elements of Last Epoch, especially compared to some of its contemporaries like Diablo 4 and even Path of Exile. And of course, the main genre that I'm referring to here would be the action RPG genre, right? And to sort of split that up into action and RPG, I think the so-called action part of it is done just fine. Compared to, say, Diablo 4, of course, Diablo 4's got the higher budget, the gameplay and the combat especially feels really good, save for perhaps some of the boss fights, which can be kind of a joke. But anyhow, in terms of like the aesthetics and like the overall budget and feel and sort of the combat of the game, I would say that Diablo 4 and perhaps later down the line, PoE 2 is looking really cool as well. So Last Epoch might have a little bit of catching up to do in that sense, although it's still like very much playable, very fun, and doesn't like break the game significantly in my opinion. But when it comes to the more RPG part of this action RPG game, I think Last Epoch does extremely well, especially with how it handles player choice in the game, as in the types of choices that players get to make are genuinely really interesting, and the puzzles that Last Epoch presents to players to solve are also really compelling and interesting, and people want to sink their time into it. And solving these puzzles and thinking about the choices in Last Epoch is actually really fun, right? And I would say that Last Epoch actually makes these choices really fun in that it makes you actually want to sit down and theory craft all these different builds and items and so forth. Whereas some of the systems in other games don't do this nearly as well. And let me give you a couple of glaring examples in my opinion. And as much as I want this game to succeed, I have to point out the skill tree and the Paragon board in Diablo 4, where the skill tree is just not very complex at all. For each skill, there's pretty much just two different choices that you can go with, and they're not really significantly game-changing differences either. And oftentimes you're just picking the one that gives you more damage, right? In a lot of cases actually, in the Diablo 4 skill tree, not only isn't there much depth in the tree itself, but in most cases, the skills that you're picking or the paths that you're picking in the tree are just based on what is going to give you a higher percentage of damage, right? That's pretty much the only like thing, or mostly the main thing that you're thinking about when picking skills in your skill tree in Diablo 4. And not only that, but you're really just picking one skill to focus around, and then the rest of the points are just sort of utility and just other things like passives to ramp up your damage without really changing anything about your core skill either. So in that way, I don't think it's nearly as deep or interesting as Last Epoch skill tree, which I will show you shortly. But before that, I also want to quickly touch on Diablo 4's Paragon board, which in my opinion is just, even getting to it for the first time in my first playthrough of Diablo 4, when the game actually still felt relatively very fresh, my first impression of the Paragon board was already not a very good one, in that it felt grindy, as to really maximize the Paragon board, you had to level up to pretty much level 100, right? And the real puzzle that it's making you solve is not a fun one, in my opinion. It's just, at the end of the day, picking the best path. So it's like a puzzle, right? A literal puzzle. And you're just picking the best path through it to get the most and like highest damage percentage nodes that you can. I suppose there's like glyphs that you can socket into like each of the glyph sockets, and you can socket different ones and compare them, but most of the time it's just like very cookie cutter type of builds, and the only real variations between the top builds for a given skill for a character in Diablo 4. It's just like who can get the more optimal path and pick up the most nodes and like the best nodes. Whereas as opposed to like actually deciding between more interesting choices or thinking about what to take and what to sacrifice and more interesting and impactful choices like that. Diablo 4's Paragon board definitely feels like a chore to me, and it's not a type of puzzle that I think players really want to solve. And I do think that Last Epoch's puzzles are generally much more interesting to solve. So for instance, if we take a look at the skill tree, you can actually specialize into 5 different skills with their very own skill trees. So for instance, if I open up my first skill here, Gathering Storm, you can see my entire tree right here. And actually my main skill that I'm using right now on my Shaman is Tempest Strike, which is an attack that rotates between 3 different elements. Lightning, physical, which is like the wind attack, and a frost attack. And I would say that one recurring theme of Last Epoch's player choices, or the way that it presents choices in an interesting way, is there's quite a bit of give and take that you have to think about. And just very different mechanics and dimensions that you also have to consider. So for instance, with my main attack here, Tempest Strike, to give you an example of this sort of kiss, curse, or give and take type decision that you can make, it's that with these talents right here, or with these points right here, like I said earlier, Tempest Strike typically has you rotating between different elements, right? But if you spec into one of these points, say Warm Shelter, you can no longer cast the Frost attack, but it'll actually cause the attack to cost less mana and increase its attack speed. And a similar thing can be done by removing, say, the Thunder attack, or the physical, or the wind physical attack. You can do all 3 if you want, but it'll do basically none of the extra spell cast with this attack, but you'll attack way faster and it'll have basically no mana cost. And so these are the types of decisions that you can make with some of Last Epoch's skill points. And another really cool thing I want to highlight is that there's actually a ton of synergy between different skill trees and different skills, which allows for an incredible amount of build diversity. So for example, if we look at Tempest Strike again, this can actually synergize with the, well, multiple abilities, but one of the examples I'm going to show you is Tornado. So this is just an attack where you, as the name implies, you cast a tornado. But what you can do with Tempest Strike is that if you spec into this point right here called Ceaseless Typhoon, whenever you cast the physical attack, which is one of the 3 attacks again, you actually have a chance to also cast a tornado. So what this does is it allows my Tempest Strikes to proc Tornado, which if I then specialize one of my skill trees, if I specialize into Tornado, Tempest Strike will basically be able to benefit from multiple of the points that I also have in Tornado, right? Which is just a crazy amount of synergy, and again really increases the possibilities and the diversities of builds pretty much exponentially. And real quick onto Last Epoch's itemization and loot experience, or loot system. It is quite interesting so far and I'm having a lot of fun with this. There's a lot of small things that kind of add up to make or complete the experience. And to compare it to Diablo 4's itemization and loot, I'm not really gonna do that right now because Diablo 4 is getting supposedly an itemization update or revamp in Season 4, which is the next season. So we'll see how that pans out. But for now, coming back to Last Epoch's itemization game, a lot of it is what you would expect of a standard ARPG, in that there are just, you know, up to 4 affixes per item, and there are also some basic affixes on each base item, so this actually gives some importance to item bases as well. So I guess this would be a bit more complex than Diablo 4 and would be more akin to, say, Path of Exile or even Diablo 2, right? And another thing is that in terms of itemizing your character, there is still sort of a checklist system where for like your best in slot, or rather like the best stats that you want on your character, those are pretty much going to be kind of cookie cutter, but to get there, it's not going to be very easy at all. And on the other hand, there's also going to be lots of other affixes that are going to be very interesting, and just different affixes that do like very different things, right? For example, just to compare it to Diablo 4 again, even though I just said I wouldn't, in Diablo 4 in its current iteration, a lot of the affixes on gear is not very interesting because they pretty much kind of do very similar things or the same thing, albeit they just kind of activate with different conditions, right? That's kind of how Diablo 4's at least offensive affixes have been. They're just kind of bland in that way where it's like damage to distance, damage to close, or like damage on Tuesdays and whatnot, right? The only really different affixes or like offensive affixes, for example, that do something actually different mechanically are like crit, which is like kind of, you know, something that people have been used to for like years or even like decades. So that's not anything too special. But for example, like crit, overpower is something new. And then there's like lucky hit, which is like a proc chance, and like I guess attack speed. But these are just either like really standard type affixes or just like there's not a lot of variety in that sense as well, right? In Last Epoch, there's definitely more variety. Some of them are pretty like simple to understand as well. Like for example, increase damage of a certain element. But I would say that there is a lot more types of affixes in Last Epoch, and there's also a prefix and suffix system, which is where most I think defensive affixes are on the prefix slot, whereas offensive ones are on the suffix slot. So there's a bit less direct competition that way, and with that you should have like less sort of loot clutter, or like there would be less chance, I guess, of like completely useless items compared to like Diablo 4, where in Last Epoch, if you get something decent in like the defense affix pool, like say for the prefix, you can then utilize the crafting system to modify the offensive side of it, right? For instance, so like if you just get one part of the item that is pretty good, for example, either the defensive or offensive side, or you have like a few affixes, or even just the base is really good, or even just you want to extract the affixes, you can also do that. So definitely with Last Epoch's crafting system, things become a lot more interesting and customizable. So like even if you get like an item that is not the best item that it could be, it's not like worth just throwing it away if it's not perfect, right? Like in Diablo 4. This makes it so that a lot of the items that you look at on the ground, which by the way, you can also use a loot filter to streamline that even more, and it's pretty easy to set up a loot filter. But anyhow, coming back to like crafting, you can easily find items that are useful in some way, right? A lot of the items that you pick up are going to be pretty useful either for the base or for some of the affixes, which if not all of them are perfect, you can actually like modify the other ones to make them better. For example, here on my weapon, I might want to add one more affix because it only has 3 out of the 4 that are available. So for instance, I can go with like, since this is still a leveling weapon, I can probably just find something that I have like a higher number of in terms of like the shards, which I have a limited number of, and just roll onto it some kind of offensive thing to give me like a slight edge for leveling, for instance. There's just a ton of things that you can do. You can also extract like useful affixes. So items are often going to be very useful even if they're not perfect. So which is I think really cool and allows for like more gradual and stepwise, I guess, progression towards better gear, right, in general. And combined with a lot of the quality of life stuff like the crafting tab, which you can conveniently just transfer all your crafting materials like affix shards to your crafting window here or crafting interface here. This makes it so much easier to manage like all these different resources for crafting and just keeping track of like the types of, you know, affix shards that you have to help you with crafting. So all this combined together makes for a really good progression system for itemization. And one more thing I want to quickly mention is there's also a cool like idle system, which if you're familiar with Diablo 2, it's like the charms that you have in your inventory that give you like additional bonuses but take up inventory space. In Last Epoch, they don't take up inventory space. Well, if you put them in your inventory, they're not going to do anything, but you can actually put them in your idle stash specific for idols, which will allow them to grant like effects. And this is where you do like the interesting like Tetris type stuff with the different types of like small or larger idols to get and mix and match like various effects, which I think is really fun and something that I've definitely missed from Diablo 2. Now, because again, I'm still playing through the campaign of Last Epoch, I can definitely not speak to some of its more endgame gameplay loops and systems, but I am very much looking forward to things like the Merchants Guild, which is like a very clever solution to trade if you want to opt into it, or the Circle of, I think it's Circle of Fate or Circle of Fortune, where it's sort of like the self-found version of the loot, loot system. So I think those are just very clever solutions to like whether you want to opt into trade. And I suppose that can be a topic for another video. And besides that, I haven't really experienced the endgame gameplay loops either. I've heard that people have said that it could use a bit of improvement and it might be, less complex or compelling than, say, Path of Exile's mapping system. However, it might actually already be more interesting than Diablo 4's. But I suppose both games are looking to add more endgame content, so we'll see how both plays out in the near future. But it does look like Last Epoch's dev definitely know what they're doing. They've made a lot of very elegant solutions and decisions regarding how to develop an ARPG that, has a lot of the features that people have loved and also expanded upon some of the things that have worked really well, from like basically taking some of the best aspects of like Diablo 2, Path of Exile, and even I suppose Diablo 3 and Diablo 4, and turning it into a very player-centric kind of gamers for gamers, or made by gamers, made for gamers type of game, is what I'm feeling from Last Epoch based on my experience so far. And with that, these are my current thoughts on Last Epoch. I'm definitely very much enjoying myself and I would recommend this game, especially for it costing just a fraction of what Diablo 4 costs if you are an ARPG fan. I'll definitely provide an updated video later on as I experience more of this game and perhaps try out Diablo 4 or keep playing Diablo 4 on the side as well. And also let me know what you think in the comment section below and I'll definitely reply to your comment. And with that, thank you so much for watching and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.